It's a very useful set of discussion points, I think, for us to engage with. There may be some questions there that you also want to address, but I'm going to open this up to the floor for questions. We've got about 20 or so minutes for questions. Just before we do that, so that you know, this event is on the record, and a summary of it will be available within 48 hours on our website, along with any other resources that are produced from it. So I'm going to ask you, please, if you do ask a question, please state who you are and what your affiliation is. And can you make your points brief? Do ask questions, but also if you want to make a point, that's fine as well. So I'll open that up. Dirk, do you want to start?
Dirk de Velde, ODI. I thought this was is a very interesting debate, very topical, because of all the sort of the crises that are currently happening, and well described by Wim Naude. I think there are 2 points that I'd like to make. One is definitional, and the other is about policies. The definitional issue is about what is vulnerability, and in particular, that question is sparked by the comment that Wim mentioned that Singapore is somehow vulnerable to shocks. I don't think it actually is. Yes, Singapore is very exposed to shocks, and it will be hit very hard in some senses, or it could be hit very hard because it is very open and so on. But it's extremely resilient, and I think it's the one small island development state or small state that we always point to that is extremely resilient, because it can always bounce back. It has the institutional capacity, the government policy framework to bounce back and to react. It's always reacted to changes in the external environment. And that brings me to sort of the definitional issue. I think that we need to be very clear, and I think you got there, but that vulnerability equals exposure minus resilient. So resilience. So that Singapore is very exposed, but it's not. It is very resilient. So therefore, it might not actually be that vulnerable. And then the second point is about policy. Are we interested in vulnerability as such, or are we actually interested in a bit more in terms of, are we interested in development? So if we're interested in development, we then need to be very clear about the link between vulnerability and development. Because if you're just trying to reduce vulnerability, you might do so at the detriment of growth. And one example might come even from the financial sector. Yes, of course, we need to reduce risk-taking dramatically so. But if you reduce any risk-taking, you also dampen any growth. And you won't have any growth. So there's the debate then is about to what extent do you need to reduce vulnerabilities while still stimulating growth? And that's what we call here at ODI crisis-resilient growth. So by growing, you become more open, you become more exposed, but at the same time, you need to make sure that you also build resilience against shocks. So you build crisis-resilient growth. And then the question is, what can the book tell us about specific measures that help build crisis-resilient growth, i.e. those that build up resilience as well as reduce exposure to shocks. Thanks.
Thank you. There's a question here.
Thank you. Rafaela Bellanca, Head on Household Energy Network. Working with energy all day, people like me think that energy is related to most of the issues connected to vulnerability or risk to poverty. In terms of access to energy, energy ladder, none of the Millennium Development Goals points is directly related to energy, but I think energy is behind most of them. Of course, food security, water. So I'd like to hear the opinion of as many of the panelists as possible about this. And also about the measurements that you mentioned, is energy taken into account in the indexes that you're working on?
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, please.
Tony Shorrocks. I have a rather deep vested interest in the project since I think I was instrumental in setting it up many years ago, and I'm just astonished at just how wonderful it's turned out. I think it's really picked up on the time, and it is something which is topical now through Haiti and through the financial crisis. But frankly, any year you choose, you can always pick up something that's going to relate to a topic like this, and presumably in the future. The one thing that I just note is that when Wim was started out and said all these man-made and natural disasters, a list of the top 10, and I immediately thought of 7/11, and it wasn't on the list, and it's been haunting me for the last hour, thinking, I know that at some point we were involved, we were thinking about getting these wars, and terrorism is not mentioned here, and when you think about vulnerability in the future, I think that is a major aspect, and I'm merely mentioning now as not because obviously this is concentrating on other, particularly on climate change and economic issues, but that third, terrorist wars, conflicts and so on, is such an important item in the overall concern about vulnerability. Then I think I just thought I would mention it right at the end as being something that we do need to also bear in mind.
Thank you. Is there another question before I go back to the panel? We'll have one more round of questions if there are any. So, okay, I'm going to ask Wim to start off. There may also be some questions from Tim you want to pick up.
Yes, thanks very much, everybody, for very, very good comments, and to Tim for his very thorough remarks and assessment of the book. I think I can just agree with what Tim has said. I think particularly from our side, and this also comes from the special issue of Oxford Development Studies on the measurement, is that we tend at this stage to be quite critical about the way in which vulnerability is measured. We recognize the problems that I think Tim has very much put his finger on. Also, to the great extent that we are dependent on historical data. And I think the debate has again flared up with the financial crisis when people started to ask questions about the predictability of the financial crisis and why, wasn't the world forewarned, or didn't the world take advanced warning seriously? And it then, it kind of like mirrored the same debate after the East Asian crisis when, these kind of like early warning systems were developed by central banks and other financial institutions, and it was shown, it's really difficult to predict this. So I think that remains an issue of, for future research that I think we do need to highlight. And it also relates to recent, I think, attempts to measure poverty in a multidimensional way. There's various initiatives, in the world at this stage, also to try to measure, the capabilities approach, which Amartya Sen has pioneered. And I think this all relates to an active field which will hopefully contribute much to human development in future. Coming to the questions by the audience, firstly the questions by Dirk, his question on the definitional aspects. I differ a little bit from your interpretation of vulnerability, and I think this kind of like debate between us shows, I think, the audience a little bit of difficulty, as Tim has also said, in trying to explain vulnerability to policymakers. I tend to see vulnerability not as the inverse of resilience. People tend to say, well, if you're resilient and you're not vulnerable, that means that somehow the two are inversely related. I tend to see vulnerability as separate from resilience. And what I try to see as the important question really here is how much at risk is a country from being affected by a negative event. And this at risk I define as vulnerability minus resilience. So you can still be very vulnerable, but you might not be at risk. Singapore might still be very vulnerable to a lot of external shocks, but they may not be at risk from it because they've got resilience. The reason why I want to make this split between the two is because they have different policy implications. You can try to lessen your vulnerability, or you can build resilience. It's going to have two different implications. So that is one way, of course, of seeing that. So your vulnerability then might depend on your exposure plus the likelihood of an event occurring. And in that way, you can say, well, is Singapore, is there a likelihood that it's going to be a decrease in international trade and in shipping through their area? And then you can say, yes, it is. They are still exposed to that. There's a very high likelihood of such an event occurring. So that is the fact that they are vulnerable, and they should be concerned about that. If you say that they are not vulnerable, it means that they should not have any early warning system. They should not be worried about something happening in future. And I think that is not something that I would consider. In terms of your question, how can vulnerability avoided? Is there measures to build resilience and reduce exposure? I think, yes, a good example that I think is the recent case of South Korea, how they had managed the financial crisis. And they had done so, for instance, by trying to keep as much people in employment as possible, to to use examples like people taking longer periods of leave or taking unpaid work, but just keeping their laborers employed within their factories, within their financial system, and not losing these people, because they discovered from the 1998 crisis that it's much more difficult to start rehiring people once your economy starts growing again. And that you can also then avoid some of the longer-term adverse effects due to adverse coping that unemployed people can engage into. And that, for me, is somewhat of a policy measure which built the resilience, because it's also a learning measure. It means that this economy has actually learned from its previous experience. It's built new bulwarks, and it learns how to get protection measures for the unemployed, but it also reduced their exposure to the long-term adverse effects of this financial crisis. The second question from the lady in front on energy. Yes, I think that's why I emphasized, in the beginning, that one of the main shocks that is of concern is, of course, the shocks to energy and increasing fuel prices and so on. But I emphasize that the real detrimental impact of that is the adverse impacts that has in terms of inequality, that there are countries that really gain and that there are countries that really lose. And that the circulation of all these petrodollars or fuel dollars, as you want to call that, and the paper oil barrels that are being traded, that this in itself creates additional risk elsewhere in the world the system. And so it's really a concern, from a vulnerability point of view. You ask about the use in indices. Well, yes, I think that it is being incorporated increasingly. For instance, I measured earlier that there are moves towards multidimensional indicators of poverty and deprivation, and these increasingly ask whether households have got access to different types of fuel, whether it is biomass fuel or electricity or whatever the source may be, to try to incorporate it into the poverty profile of the household. So there's work on that regard that I think is important. On a macro level as well, many of these vulnerability indicators look at whether a country is a net importer or exporter of oil, which makes quite a difference when there is an oil price shock to a country's macro vulnerability. So I think that takes place. The third comment or question from Tony Shorrocks is, I think, completely true. I had tried to mention something about that in a rather complex figure to try to relate civil conflict to all of these crises. And it's difficult, and I didn't want to go too much into conflict because I realize that is almost a topic on its own, which can almost lead us into different directions. And it's certainly a valid question to ask the extent to which the events that one has seen increases in conflict has been related to the fact that our world economy has gone through all these different shocks and have seemingly not been able to be successful in achieving the Millennium Development Goals and other goals that we have set for the world economy. So I agree that is maybe that's a symptom of the instability and problems that we have seen in the global economy, and certainly something to be taken seriously. I mean, one thing that we know as well, after the Cold War, the number of conflicts, for instance, in Africa has certainly declined. But we have seen also in the last 2 or 3 years that there are worrisome signs that it has been increased. The recent Economist Democracy Index was stating that in the last 3 to 4 years there has been basically stagnation in the way in which democracies have been rolling out across the world, that the rollout of democracy after the end of the Cold War has basically now come to a stop in the last 3 or 4 years. And I see that's a very worrisome trend in terms of freedoms, and it also probably a signal of future conflict. I don't know, Amelia, if you want to respond as well.
Well, I just briefly, thanks again for the comments, and I think an important issue that Tim mentioned was whether globalization is increasing vulnerability. And as I mentioned in my presentation, the main link of these countries, not just a small island, but any country, to vulnerability is trade or capital flows. Most of these economies are too underdeveloped to be affected by speculative capital flows, but they are affected by the easiness that is moving foreign direct investment from one country to the other. So they are exposed, but they also benefit from that because, as he mentioned, it creates, globalization has created more opportunities for growth, but the issue here is whether they can take up this opportunity, and basically the key issue here is how they can diversify production and trade where they have the limited natural resources or limited physical capacities. And so this is an important issue. And also, taking a step back and going to the concept of fragile state and linking to what Tony said, basically conflict is an element on the definition of fragility. And if you look at the different definitions, whether there is the donor's definition or the World Bank or even the DFID, a key issue is that these countries are countries under stress basically because of the threat to the local authority or because of the abuse of the authority. And here you have countries like North Korea that will fall into a fragile state category because of this. And also because most of these countries are unable to provide basic services, makes the issue of fragility important for policy, for economic policy. And then going beyond the issue of conflict, if you take the case of the Pacific Islands, that's a defining feature of the sources of vulnerability beyond the remoteness, beyond the cost of doing trade with these islands. So I think this is an important issue, and we cover that in some of the outputs related to the Pacific. And we had contributions of people like Paul Collier that have worked a lot on this policy assessment and institutional assessment. And finally, going again to the issue of fragility and terrorism, as Tony mentioned, it is an economic activity that has shown to be profitable and is going to be there. So it goes beyond to what the international development policy has defined as state fragility. It is, as I will say that the example that he mentioned has to do more with the economics of terrorism, and it increases the vulnerability of the world economy and also damages other channels like capital flows, financial markets, and yes, it is important to consider. So basically, that's it.
Did you want to make any comments, Tim?
No, I mean, with regard to Dirk's comment, I'm wondering if we actually have the same understanding of the issues but are maybe attaching different words to different parts of the total. I mean, I think there's an agreement that the end outcome, a state of being vulnerable to something is a combination of whether you're exposed to a risk, whether a risk might affect you, together with whether you can cope with that risk. And that there's, you've got to look at both bits of that to understand the overall level of vulnerability. I'm afraid, I think energy does drive many of these forms of vulnerability, but albeit I think some of them, indirectly. I don't know the indices as well as the others do, so I'm not sure I could add much there. And yes, I think, I think in part the question goes back to vulnerability to what, and we can look at vulnerability to poverty. That's sort of the focus, but we also need to look at vulnerability to violence, and that very obviously and directly relates to state fragility and the kind of enormous reversals that somewhere like the DRC has gone through. Needs to be part of an understanding of what we mean by vulnerability in the developing world.
Okay, thank you. We have time, if there are any more questions, briefly for a couple more questions. So there's one here and then one over there.
Thank you very much. I'm Warda from Natural Resource Institute. I would like to ask a question to Amelia. You did present about small island state. Where you mentioned that in Caribbean, for example, that the disaster might be once a year at least. Do you think a case like this will improve people's resilience compared to the country where this disaster just happened once and sudden and unpredictable? And also to Wim, considering all the thing that you take into account about disasters, the case is increasing, and the trend of climate change that might make disaster more frequently in the future. Do you think the Millennium Development Goals can be achieved to halve poverty in this situation? Thank you.
Okay, and there's one more question over here.
Thank you. Terry Green from the IDL Group. At the start, Caroline mentioned the policy recommendations coming out of the report. And I'd be interested to ask the authors and the panel more generally, if, as a result of the work that you've done, you can identify any policy innovations or new institutional approaches which look promising and look interesting that we should all keep our eye on, both in terms of social protection, but also in terms of the graduation of people out of a situation of poverty. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'll start with Amelia this time.
Okay, well, this is an interesting question, the issue of the recurrence of natural disaster, and I think that makes the task of planning and mitigation more difficult. The fact that they are frequent is there, and especially if the states have limited resources to deal with it. So here, this brings an element of extra vulnerability, if you want to say, to these countries and to these people. I mean, there are some actions on the ground. For example, the international community has tried to promote insurance against risk, but these issues are costly, especially when there are limited resources and the options are whether investing in insurance or investing in basic needs. But this is one issue, and there has been, and that links to the question of the gentleman on innovations and the role of not just the standard northern donors, but also the developing countries like Brazil, China, even African countries have come and put money into this, and Mexico, for example, to this type of global or local regional insurance schemes. So it's an issue. From the natural science point of view, it's clear that they are going to happen. The question is how to better deal with it, given that these countries have limited resources. The case of Haiti also has shown interesting examples. For example, the UNDP has a program that is basically creating employment in the local communities, using people from these affected cities in the rebuilding and reconstruction work. So they get paid directly, so they have money to buy food and to go on with normal life. Instead of going through a complicated change of events or and channels, they are creating this cash for work program. But this is after a shock happens. The work has, and the policy work has to focus on the prevention and what can be prevented, and also on the insurance part. But it is costly, and it needs, like other areas of development, a lot of international help to be able to be effective.
Tim, do you want to make any response to that?
In terms of policy innovations, as I say, I think there is an awful lot of interesting work emerging on social protection. I think social transfers have become increasingly accepted as part of the response, not just in a protective sense, but also the sense that it can help people escape poverty traps and contribute to, as well as benefit from, long-term economic growth. And really seeing that spread out from the Latin American middle-income countries where it is more affordable and they have the institutional capacity to do it. But now through South Africa into Ethiopia, the Indian National employment guarantee scheme. So I think there is a lot of interest in this, and these I think will prove their value. You know, if you think of social protection in a wealthy country, then social insurance has got to be a big part of the picture. And I think that's the much bigger challenge for the developing world, you know, where poor households don't have the capacity to make a regular premium payment, and where institution and governance arrangements are such that they might be very nervous about, you know, putting into either a state or a private insurance mechanism. So I think that's the area where we should look for some innovation over the long term, and it'll probably only be when countries are at higher levels of average income and institutional strength. But I think that would be interesting. You know, weather indexed crop insurance, those kind of innovations, very early stage, and amongst development partners supporting countries, I think the shift, a very necessary one, is away from lots of projects and pilots and focusing on, you know, interesting single interventions for small areas, and much more towards thinking, okay, what's the overall risk and vulnerability profile of this population? You know, what's the different sources of vulnerability for different groups? How do we, a nice analogy of weaving the safety net, how do we put in place different programs to provide effective coverage? So I think now the emphasis for donor agencies is on supporting the kind of institutional development for those kind of systems at the country level. And I think this can be related to other forms of vulnerability and volatility as well, the concept of rebalancing growth. You have to feel sorry for quite a few of the countries in the developing world. They were told, you know, grow by exporting, you know, sell your goods and services to the developed world. And of course, when the developed world went into a tailspin because of our financial systems, you know, exports and FDI flows for the developing world drop back. I think there's interest now in trying to get, in some of the bigger countries, and it's particularly relevant to the smaller countries, but harder to do, trying to get some better balance between domestic and export-led growth. And actually, social protection can be one way of doing that. There's a lot of debate about how in China, if there was more effective health insurance provided by the government, that would encourage households to take money basically out from under the mattress, where they keep it in case they get ill, and start spending it. And, you know, so actually social protection can be part of a stimulus package. So I think those are some of the interesting areas for keeping an eye on.
Okay, and before I pass to Wim for the final word, I would just add that given the profile of vulnerability in relation to gender, that the work that's ongoing, and we need more of it, on gender and social protection, I think is very important. And there's a surprising dearth, I think, of past studies on gender and social protection. I know there's some ongoing at the moment, but I think that's a very important area. We have one question from our web link from Maya Gavrilovic, who's asking about how the study can deal with youth-specific characteristics of vulnerability. So, Wim, I'm going to ask you to have the final word on any questions you want to respond to.
Okay. Well, thank you. For the first question on the MDGs, I think some countries will make progress in some of the indicators, but I think, you know, also the latest financial crisis will probably mean that a lot of countries will not be able to achieve those goals. And I think that's one of the aspects which we had highlighted earlier. The question from Mr. Green on what is the policy innovations. In our final chapter, we try to pull together a novel view in terms of approaching vulnerability. And I think part of that relates to what Tim has referred to, integrating household level, micro level vulnerability with the macroeconomic fragile context. And so in the last chapter, we have a diagram in which we try to show the kind of like spear point, if you want to, of policy interventions or policy measures, that these should be driven at what we call assets and context fragility. And assets and context fragility play both a role in the type of vulnerability which households have to face, but they also play a role after a household has been affected by a natural disaster or by some exogenous shock, in terms of its responses. So we see that as kind of like a leitmotif, if you want to, in this context. Under assets, we mean both household capabilities and household abilities, but also household physical assets and insurance. And we try to relate this to the context, whether the context creates certain risk on an idiosyncratic way or in a covariate way, and how this also relates to the state fragility context. And I think therein lies the policy innovations, in that you need to strengthen households' assets and capabilities, but the important thing as well is that households are very much resilient in themselves. You cannot leave them alone to cope with the crisis, but you also have to realize that the households are going to respond by themselves, and that it's often very much in the interest of policies to rather go with the flow of where households want to react and strengthen their own responses, rather than try something that might actually go counter to the way in which households are doing it themselves. A good example that we mention here is, for instance, the questions of migration, whereby sometimes the first knee-jerk reaction in countries, often countries that receives migrants, is to stop these migrants. And we often find that during times of crisis, like right at the moment, if you read the newspaper, in countries across the world, there are negative responses towards migration taking place. And a whole new debate. I think Newsweek this week had something on migration, Times had something on migration. And migration is one of those responses of households which they take to respond to crises. And the policy response, therefore, is often, I think, in my view, in terms of the book as well, maybe a little bit different. So I think that's something to answer the question. And then I think the very important question on youth, and the youth-specific characteristics of vulnerability and how. There's not a single chapter in the book that's specifically dedicated to the youth, but maybe they should have. Certainly I think that youth appears in almost all of the chapters somehow as a vulnerable group, but also as a group that offers resilience. For instance, let me just show a few examples from the different chapters where the youth have been highlighted. The first aspect is regarding adverse coping. That's often the very first concern that one should have, is that it's the youth that drops out of school. It's the youth that very often engage with a higher probability in crime. So this kind of adverse coping affects the youth much more than probably older groups. The youth are often also more vulnerable to unemployment because they don't have necessary experience or skills in the labor market, so they very often find it more difficult during crisis times to hold on to a job or to gain employment. And we know that high unemployment, especially of the youth, are related to social unrest and institution and unrest and instability. We often find that youth are the first to migrate during times of crisis. Economists tend to think of that as that the youth has got a much longer time horizon, so the discounted benefits of migrating might be much higher, so they tend to make the migration decision much quicker. But that leaves them exposed, as the chapter of India has also shown in our book, to many types of risks. We're also in the section of the book that deals with natural disasters. The story that has been told is that children and women are particularly at risk from these natural disasters, in terms of illnesses, in terms of shelter, in terms of being exploited, etc. One can also read in the newspapers what has happened in Haiti to understand who are the people that are now suffering the most. But then it's not just only a question of being negatively affected. I think it's also a question of resilience, that the youth do contribute by migrating to in terms of remittances. It's also the basis ultimately for social support. We know that the advanced countries are actually grappling with the opposite problem, that they don't have enough. The youthful population is shrinking, and that means that the tax base is shrinking, and that the burden of caring for the elderly are getting smaller and smaller, and spreading pressure on state resources. You have the opposite in many developing countries, so they can see the youth as being a possible source of social support and providing state resources to create better protection systems in future. I hope I've dealt with that question as I could at this stage. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to end the meeting. I want to thank our panellists very much for a really interesting and stimulating discussion. I'm sure everyone looks forward to engaging more with this book on vulnerability. So can we thank them in the usual way?